The Rock's silences woke reporter live. His response had everyone on their feet. The crisp January morning sun poured through the towering windows of the LA Convention Center's main hall, casting long shadows over the polished marble floors. Outside, a growing crowd of reporters, photographers, and eager fans had been gathering since dawn, their excited murmurs creating an electric buzz that could be felt even through the thick glass doors. Inside, event coordinators hurried back and forth, making final adjustments to the staging area. At the center, the podium stood in perfect alignment against a backdrop featuring the Dreams to Reality Youth Foundation logo, ready for its moment in the spotlight. Production assistants did one last round of microphone checks, their faces tense with the pressure of making sure everything was flawless for one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Backstage, Marcus Rodriguez, the foundation's director, paced nervously. Every few seconds, he glanced at his watch. 15 minutes, he muttered, straightening his tie once again. The foundation's latest initiative was ambitious, a massive $50 million investment into building cutting-edge training facilities in underserved communities across the country. This press conference had to go off without a hitch. "He's here." A young intern burst through the side door, her face glowing with excitement. Mr. Johnson just arrived at the private entrance. Immediately, the backstage area erupted into controlled chaos. Security personnel took their positions, and last-minute preparations moved into overdrive. Even with all the commotion, Marcus could hear the heightened excitement from the main hall as the press caught wind of The Rock's arrival. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson strode into the backstage area, his towering presence commanding the room's attention. Despite his imposing physique, he carried himself with a warmth that instantly put people at ease. He wore a navy suit, perfectly tailored to his broad frame, exuding both confidence and sophistication. "Marcus." The Rock's face broke into his famous million-dollar smile as he approached the foundation director. "How we feeling about today, brother?" Marcus managed a nervous grin. "Everything's ready, Mr. Johnson. It's a full house. Every major network and publication has someone here." The Rock placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Remember, man, this isn't about me. It's about those kids out there, the ones who need to know that someone believes in them. We're just here to show them that someone does." Before Marcus could respond, Emily Chen, The Rock's longtime publicist, approached with a tablet in hand. "Dwayne, let's go over the key points one more time. The press is particularly interested in how the communities are chosen for these facilities." The Rock nodded, but his attention was drawn to a young security guard standing nearby, struggling to keep his cool. His name tag read David. "Hold that thought, Emily," The Rock said, stepping toward him. "First big event, David?" he asked with a genuine smile. David's eyes widened. "Why, yes, sir. I mean, I've been with the company for 3 months, but this is my first high-profile event." "Well, you're doing great, brother," The Rock said. "Mind if we take a quick pic? My social team can post it later. Show some love to the real heroes keeping us safe today." David's face lit up as one of the media team members snapped a few shots. That small interaction instantly relaxed the atmosphere backstage. The moment served as a reminder. Despite all the high stakes, they were working with someone who never lost sight of the human element. Meanwhile, in the main hall, reporters and photographers jostled for position. The air buzzed with anticipation. The Rock was known for delivering great moments, for being real, and nobody wanted to miss a single second. Among the journalists, Sarah Chan from the Digital Times adjusted her laptop. Unlike her colleagues, who were simply reporting on the Foundation's announcement, she had a different motive. Her recent series on celebrity charities had gained major attention, and she saw this event as her golden opportunity to make an even bigger name for herself. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice echoed over the PA system. Please take your seats. The press conference will begin in 5 minutes. Conversations hushed as the lights dimmed slightly, shifting focus to the podium. Marcus stepped up first, adjusting the microphone before addressing the crowd. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. This is a milestone moment for the Dreams to Reality Youth Foundation. Before I introduce our founder and chairman, we'd like to share a short video highlighting the impact of our programs over the past year. The screens behind him flickered to life, displaying a powerful montage. Young athletes training in makeshift gyms, students studying at community centers, and volunteers working tirelessly to keep these facilities running. The production was flawless, driving home the importance of the initiative. The energy in the room was undeniable. The stage was set. The audience was locked in, and The Rock was ready to take the mic. What happened next? No one would ever forget. The production remained professional, yet retained an authentic touch, focusing on real stories instead of flashy marketing. As the video played, The Rock watched from backstage, his expression thoughtful. Emily approached once again, tablet in hand, but he waved her off. I got this, he said quietly. These kids' stories? That's all the talking points I need. The video wrapped up with a powerful statement from a teenage girl. Sometimes, all it takes is for someone to show you what's possible. Dreams to Reality didn't just give us a place to go. They gave us a reason to believe in ourselves. As the lights returned, Marcus stepped back up to the podium. It is my great honor to introduce a man who truly needs no introduction, he announced, his voice carrying through the hall. But his dedication to giving back, that deserves recognition every single day. Please welcome the founder and chairman of Dreams to Reality Youth Foundation, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. The room erupted in applause as The Rock made his way onto the stage, radiating his signature energy and charisma. With a warm handshake, he greeted Marcus before stepping up to the podium, scanning the audience with a genuine smile. Thank you, Marcus. And thank you all for being here today. He paused, making direct eye contact with several people in the crowd. You know, every time I watch that video, it hits me, right here. He placed a hand over his heart. Because every single one of those kids reminds me of where I came from. But more importantly, they remind me why we do this. His voice carried effortlessly through the room, never losing its personal touch. Today, we're not just announcing an expansion of our programs. We're making a commitment, one that will redefine what's possible for young people in communities that have been overlooked for far too long. He went on to outline the initiative's key details, 15 brand new training facilities across the country, each offering far more than just athletic equipment. They would provide educational resources, career counseling, and mental health support. As he spoke, the screens behind him displayed architectural designs and maps of the planned locations. These, he said, gesturing toward the images, these aren't just gyms. These are launching pads for dreams. Every kid who walks through those doors will know someone believes in them, that their potential, it matters, that their future, it's worth investing in. For about 20 minutes, he detailed the program's timeline, partnership opportunities, and projected impact. Throughout, he remained fully engaged, occasionally stepping away from the script to share personal stories or acknowledge people in the audience. Finally, he turned back to the crowd with a grin. All right, I know you've all been patient. Let's hear what's on your minds. Instantly, hands shot up across the room. The Rock pointed to a reporter in the front row. Mike Thompson, ESPN. The man introduced himself. Mr. Johnson, these facilities represent a major investment. How do you respond to critics who say this money would be better spent on direct financial aid? The Rock nodded thoughtfully. Great question, Mike. Look, we're not here to replace other forms of community support. We're here to complement them. His tone was measured, confident. What we've learned. Sustainable change? It takes more than writing checks. It means creating spaces where transformation can happen, day after day, year after year. He gestured toward the screens. These facilities? They're going to create jobs in these communities. They'll provide safe spaces for kids to grow, to learn. They'll become the backbone for even more community programs. This isn't just about building buildings. It's about building futures. More hands shot up. The lady in the middle, the Rock pointed. Janet Rivera, NBC News, she said. Can you share more about how these locations were chosen? Absolutely, he replied smoothly. We worked with community leaders, analyzed demographic data, and, most importantly, we listened to the people in these neighborhoods. Each location was selected based on need and the impact we could make. The questions kept coming, some technical, others about the foundation's long-term vision. And through it all, The Rock answered with his signature mix of professionalism and personal connection, never losing sight of the bigger picture. Then, about 40 minutes into the Q&A, Sarah Chen stood up. Her voice cut through the room, sharp, deliberate. The shift in energy was immediate. The Rock acknowledged her with a polite nod, unaware of the challenge about to unfold. Sarah Chen, Digital Times, she began, her tone edged with something that made a few nearby reporters glance her way. Mr. Johnson, don't you think your success comes from privilege rather than hard work? After all, as a third-generation wrestler, doors were already open for you. The silence was deafening. Every camera in the room turned toward him, capturing the moment in real time. The mechanical hum of shutters clicking underscored the heavy pause. The Rock's hand remained steady on the podium. His expression, controlled, composed. For a man known for his larger-than-life personality, his stillness spoke volumes. Standing off to the side, Marcus Rodriguez felt his pulse quicken. He'd been through countless press conferences with Dwayne, but something about this moment? It felt different. The Rock finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Let me stop you right there. His tone wasn't angry. If anything, there was something deeper, something personal. He adjusted the microphone slightly, the small movement pulling every eye back to him. Sarah held her ground, notebook in hand, a small smirk playing at the corner of her lips. She had prepared for this, had rehearsed this moment in her mind over and over. But something about the Rock's demeanor made her hesitate. You know, he said, leaning forward slightly, it's interesting you bring up privilege. His eyes swept the room before settling back on Chen. Because privilege, it's a complex thing, isn't it? It's not just about where you end up. It's about where you start, the journey you take, and most importantly, what you do with the opportunities you're given. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the defensive response people had expected. The Rock took a measured sip of water before continuing. My grandfather, Peter Maivia, the man you're referring to as the start of my privilege, let me tell you about him. His voice shifted, becoming rich with emotion, with memory. When he first came to America, he cleaned toilets. Not as a side job, not as a temporary gig. That was his job. He cleaned toilets to put food on the table, to give his family a chance at something better. He stepped away from the podium, moving toward the edge of the stage. Security instinctively tensed, but his body language remained open, and in that moment, the entire room hung onto his every word. Unthreatening. My father, Rocky Johnson? Yes, he was a wrestler. But what many don't know is that before he made any kind of name for himself, he worked multiple jobs, while wrestling in small towns for just $40 a night. $40, Miss Chen. He would drive hundreds of miles, put his body on the line, all for $40 and a dream of something better. Sarah Chen's confident smile faltered slightly, but she pressed on. But surely, those connections. The Rock's eyebrow lifted in his signature expression, but this time, there was no humor in it. Connections? Let me tell you about connections. His voice held a weight that made the room still. When I had $7 in my pocket. Yes, $7. That's not a marketing story. After being cut from the Canadian Football League, those connections weren't answering my calls. Reaching into his suit jacket, he pulled out his wallet. The action was so unexpected that even the most seasoned photographers seemed momentarily caught off guard. Opening it, he carefully removed an old, worn photograph. This, he said, holding it up, though only those in the first few rows could see it clearly. This is the studio apartment I lived in when I was starting out. That used mattress on the floor? That was my bed. That stack of cans in the corner? Tuna, because it was all I could afford. A young photographer in the front row instinctively raised his camera, but the Rock shook his head gently. No photos of this, brother. This isn't for show. This is real life. He carefully placed the photograph back into his wallet before continuing. You want to talk about privilege, Miss Chen? Then let's talk about it. Let's talk about the privilege of having parents who taught me the value of hard work. The privilege of knowing that when life knocks you down, you get back up. The privilege of understanding that success. It isn't just about what you achieve. It's about how many people you can help along the way. Sarah Chan shifted slightly, her professional demeanor cracking just a bit. She hadn't expected this level of personal disclosure. But, your family name. My family name? The Rock's voice sharpened, his intensity rising. Let me tell you what that family name meant in practical terms. His expression hardened. It meant expectations. It meant that every time I stepped into a ring, people were waiting for me to fail. Rocky Maivia. That was my first wrestling name, combining my father's and grandfather's names. His voice dropped slightly, but the weight behind it remained. You know what the crowds chanted? Die, Rocky, die. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Many of the younger reporters had never heard this part of the Rock's story. But you know what, he continued, his voice steady. Those chants, they taught me something important. They taught me that no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, you have to earn everything in this life. Nothing is given. And that is why I'm standing here today, talking about these youth centers. Because I want kids to understand that their starting point, it does not define their end point. He moved back toward the podium, his steps deliberate, his presence commanding. So, Miss Chen, when you talk about privilege, make sure you understand exactly what you're talking about. He paused. Let it settle. Then, his voice softened, yet carried even more power. Because yes, I am privileged. Privileged to have learned these lessons. Privileged to have had parents who sacrificed everything for me. Privileged to have failed and gotten back up. Privileged to now be in a position where I can help others do the same. From the wings, Emily Chen, his publicist, stood frozen, her tablet completely forgotten in her hands. This wasn't in the talking points they had prepared, but she knew better than to try and redirect this moment. You know what real privilege is? The Rock continued, his voice shifting to something deeper, more personal. Real privilege? It's standing here today, looking out at kids who are where I once was, and telling them that their dreams matter, that their hard work matters, that they matter. The room was silent, hanging on to his every word. He reached for his water, took a slow sip, then looked back at the crowd. So yes, I had a father and grandfather in the wrestling business, but let me make one thing absolutely clear. Having a connection, and actually making something of that connection, those are two completely different things. I could have relied on my name, could have just expected doors to swing open automatically, but instead, I chose to put in the work. Sarah Chan had slowly lowered herself back into her seat, her notebook now resting closed in her lap. The Rock noticed, but didn't address it directly. You want to know what I did with whatever privilege I may have had? His voice carried a weight of certainty. I turned it into opportunity, not just for myself, but for others. He gestured slightly toward the screen that had played the earlier video. Those kids you saw, they're not looking for handouts. What they want, what they deserve, is for someone to believe in them, to show them what's possible when opportunity meets hard work. Straightening his tie, he gave a small nod, almost as if signaling a shift in his tone. Now, Miss Chen, I do appreciate you bringing this up. I really do. Because this conversation, it gives us a chance to have an honest discussion about success, about responsibility, about what we owe to the next generation. Then, he did something unexpected. He smiled, genuinely, warmly. And you know what? I'd love to personally invite you to visit one of our current facilities, not as a reporter, but as someone who clearly cares about addressing inequality. The invitation caught Sarah completely off guard. She parted her lips slightly, as if to respond, but for a moment, no words came. I mean that sincerely, he continued, voice steady, because these centers we're building, they're not about privilege. They're about possibility, about creating spaces where kids, no matter their starting point, can come and work toward their dreams, where they can learn that success. It isn't handed to you. It's earned, through sweat, through dedication, through perseverance. He shifted his gaze now, addressing everyone in the room. And that's what I want people to understand about this initiative. We're not just building buildings. We're not just creating programs. We're establishing proof grounds, places where young people can learn the same lessons I did, that your circumstances don't define your potential. That hard work beats talent, when talent doesn't work hard. And that true success, it's not about how many doors were opened for you. It's about how many doors you open for others. He paused, letting those words settle. The silence in the room was different now, no longer filled with tension, no longer an anticipation of conflict. Instead, it was thoughtful, reflective. So, Miss Chen, he said finally, his voice carrying a quiet finality, you asked about privilege, and I've given you my answer. Then, his expression shifted. His eyes locked onto hers. But now, I have a question for you. The room seemed to hold its breath. What are you going to do with your privilege, your platform, your voice? His gaze swept across the crowd. Because we all have some form of privilege, and the real measure of a person, it isn't whether they have it, it's how they use it, to make a difference in this world. The question wasn't meant to be answered out loud. But its impact, undeniable. Some reporters had stopped taking notes entirely. Even the most cynical among them couldn't deny the raw authenticity of what they had just witnessed. Then, just as effortlessly, The Rock's familiar, warm smile returned. "So," he said, lightening the mood just a bit, "would anyone else like to ask about the actual programs we're implementing? Because trust me, I'd love to tell you about the amazing things our team has planned. But your social media." Sarah Chan suddenly stood up again, her voice not quite as steady as before, drawing surprised glances from her fellow journalists. The Rock turned toward her, his expression now carrying a blend of patience and understanding. He could see the conflict on her face, the struggle between pushing forward with her planned narrative and fully absorbing what she had just heard. "My social media," he interrupted, though his tone was noticeably softer now. "It shows where I am today." He had caught the slight tremor in her hands. "But let me tell you what it doesn't show." He took a slow, deep breath, and in that moment, the polished celebrity exterior seemed to fade completely. The hundreds of people filling the room, they no longer mattered. He spoke with a rawness that caught everyone off guard. "It doesn't show the nights I lay there staring at the ceiling in that studio apartment, wondering if I just made the biggest mistake of my life by giving up on football." His voice carried a rare vulnerability, one that made even the most seasoned reporters lean forward in their seats. "It doesn't show the depression I fought through after my football career ended." A camera shutter clicked in the silence, the sound echoing off the walls. The Rock paused, gathering his thoughts. "You know what else it doesn't show?" He gestured slightly toward her phone. "The nights I questioned everything. The mornings where I had to force myself to keep going. The moments I sat in my car outside the gym, not because I was taking a break, but because I needed to convince myself just to get out and walk in, just to face another day." Marcus Rodriguez, still watching from the side of the stage, discreetly pulled out his phone and quickly typed a message to the Foundation's social media team. "Don't post anything yet. Let this breathe." Sarah Chun slowly lowered her phone to her side. "But you've never talked about this before," she said, her journalistic instincts pushing her to dig deeper. The Rock nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. "You're right." His gaze held steady as he stepped away from the podium, moving closer to the edge of the stage. "And you know why I'm talking about it now? Because right now, watching this, listening to this, there are kids who need to hear something real. Something beyond the polished social media posts and the curated success stories." He turned now, addressing everyone in the room. But somehow, his words seemed meant for someone beyond just those in attendance. "Depression? It doesn't care about your followers. Anxiety? It doesn't check your bank account when you're lying awake at 3 a.m. wondering if you're good enough." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Your IMDb page? That doesn't bring much comfort either." From the back row, a young journalist quickly wiped at her eyes, trying to maintain her professional composure. The Rock noticed, but didn't slow down. His voice only grew stronger. "You see these posts now," he said, gesturing as if scrolling through a phone screen. "The workouts, the movie sets, the premieres. But what you don't see, the journey, the doubt, the fear, the moments when it all felt impossible." Then, his gaze returned to Sarah Chan. "And you know what? I'm glad you brought this up. I'm glad you're making me talk about it." His voice carried weight. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear this, needs to know that their struggles, they don't disqualify them from success, that their doubts don't make them weak, that their fears don't make them frauds. A hand shot up from the middle of the room. The Rock acknowledged it with a nod. James Martinez, Psychology Today. Mr. Johnson, given what you've shared, how does this impact the mental health components being planned for these new youth centers? The question seemed to ignite something in him. That's exactly what I want to talk about, he said, his energy returning. These facilities, they're not just about physical training. They're not just about academic support. They're about creating spaces where young people can be vulnerable, where they can talk about their struggles without shame. His eyes found Sarah Chen's once again. She was still standing, but now, her phone hung forgotten at her side. You wanted to expose something today, didn't you? He asked, his voice calm. Wanted to pull back the curtain on the reality behind social media? She nodded slowly, a flush creeping up her neck. Well, here's the truth. His voice dropped slightly, but the intensity behind it remained. Success. It's not a straight line. It's not just a highlight reel. It's messy. It's complicated. And sometimes, it hurts like hell. His next words landed with force. But do you know what makes it worthwhile? When you can use your experience, everything you've been through, to help someone else through their own darkness. Then, the Rock reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. So let's do something right now, he said, holding it up. Let's show people what social media doesn't usually show. He handed the phone to Emily, his publicist, who had quietly stepped closer to the stage. Emily, would you mind taking a picture? Not of me. He gestured toward the room. Of this. Of all these people who came here today, expecting to hear about buildings and programs. But instead, they're having a real conversation. About mental health. About struggle. About what it actually means to succeed. Emily lifted the phone, steady despite the unexpected shift in direction. The click of her camera was soon joined by others, as photographers across the room captured the moment. The Rock let a small, knowing smile form. Because that's what social media should be, he said, his voice softer now. Not just the victories, but the battles. Not just the achievements. The journey. Not just the strength, but the vulnerability, the very thing that makes us human. Sarah Chen finally found her voice again. I came here with assumptions, she admitted, the cracks in her professional mask becoming more visible. I had this whole narrative planned. Of course you did, the Rock responded, his voice carrying genuine understanding. We all have narratives we believe in. But sometimes, the most important story isn't the one we came here to tell. It's the one we discover, when we're willing to listen. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Reporters who had arrived, ready to ask tough questions about funding and logistics, they were now jotting down notes about authenticity, about mental health. So let me tell you what these youth centers are really about, the Rock said, his energy shifting. Yes, they'll have state-of-the-art equipment. Yes, they'll have educational resources. But more than anything, they'll have people. People who understand that everyone is fighting their own battles. People who know that sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is admit when you're struggling. He walked back toward the podium, but instead of standing behind it, he remained beside it. Because that was the point. Because when I was at my lowest, I didn't just need opportunities. I didn't just need equipment. I needed people. People who could look me in the eye and say, I see you. I hear you. And your struggles? They don't define you. Sarah Chen had finally sat down. But her reporter's notebook? It remained closed. The story she had intended to write had shifted into something else. something deeper, something personal, something infinitely more important. The rock let his gaze sweep across the room once more, his expression thoughtful. You know, we talk a lot about building physical strength, about academic success, about career achievement. But what about the strength it takes to keep going when every part of you wants to quit? What about the courage to start over? What about the wisdom to know when to ask for help? He gestured toward the screens behind him, which still displayed the renderings of the planned facilities. These buildings, he nodded toward them. They're not just spaces for physical transformation. They're sanctuaries for personal growth. Places where it's okay to not be okay, where failure isn't final, where struggle isn't shameful. A heavy silence fell over the room. Even the cameras had stopped clicking, as if the photographers themselves realized this moment. It transcended the usual need to document everything. And then the rock continued. So yes, he said, his voice carrying both strength and gentleness. My social media, it shows where I am now. But after today, I hope it starts showing something more. Something real. Something human. Because that's what these kids need to see. Not just the destination, but the journey. Not just the triumph, but the struggle. Not just the strength, but the vulnerability that made that strength possible. The silence inside the convention center lingered, heavy with the weight of shared emotion, with the impact of unexpected revelations. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily above, illuminating faces, faces that reflected the depth of what had just unfolded. Then, movement. From the back of the room, a young man slowly rose to his feet. His blazer was slightly oversized, his press badge identifying him as part of a college newspaper. At the start of the day, that detail might have seemed insignificant. But now, it carried a meaning far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Mr. Johnson, he began, his voice steady, despite the emotion visible on his face. I was one of those kids in your youth program last year. I was homeless. The rock's expression softened immediately. Recognition dawned in his eyes. The young man continued, his confidence growing with each word. But now I'm reporting for my college paper. The same college I learned about, through your foundation's education program. The entire convention center remained still. Not a single sound, except for the footsteps of the rock as he stepped down from the stage, walking deliberately through the center aisle. Security moved to follow, but with a simple wave of his hand, he signaled them to stand down. Marcus Thompson. The rock's voice carried through the room as he approached the young reporter. I remember you, brother. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Gasps. No one had expected him to actually know the student's name. Marcus's eyes widened. You remember me? The rock reached him, placing both hands firmly on his shoulders. Of course I do. A pause. You were writing even back then, on that beat-up laptop in the center's common room. You showed me one of your stories, remember? About your first night in the shelter. Marcus nodded, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. I never thought. You meet so many people. The rock cut him off gently, his voice carrying through the silent room. Some stories stick with you. A breath. Some people's journeys become part of your own story. Turning to face the press, the rock kept one hand firmly on Marcus's shoulder. This right here, is what we're talking about. This is why we do what we do. Marcus didn't need someone to just hand him things. He needed someone to believe in him, in his potential. He needed tools, opportunities. And then, Then, he needed people to get out of his way while he did the real work. From the crowd, Sarah Chen, who had been watching intently, found herself reaching for her phone once more. But this time, not to challenge, not to confront, but to document this moment. The Rock noticed, and smiled. "Go ahead," he nodded toward her. "Some moments deserve to be shared." The sound of clicking cameras filled the room. Phones were raised, recording the moment as The Rock gestured for Marcus to walk with him to the front. "Tell them," he encouraged. "Tell them your story." Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the sea of faces, faces that included the very journalists he had studied and admired in his classes. "A year and a half ago," he began, his voice steady, "I was sleeping in my car. I had aged out of the foster care system. I was trying to finish high school while working 2 jobs. And everything, it felt impossible." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "Then, I found out about the Dreams to Reality Center. At first, I just went there to shower. But then, one of the counselors noticed. I was always writing in this old notebook." The Rock watched, pride evident in his expression, as Marcus shared his journey. From homeless student to scholarship recipient, from shelter resident to college journalist. "The foundation didn't just give me a place to go," Marcus finished. His voice carried the weight of lived experience. "They gave me a reason to believe in myself." The Rock pulled him into a firm embrace, and the room erupted in applause. Even the most cynical reporters found themselves caught up in the raw emotion of the moment. As the applause began to fade, Sarah Chan stood once again. But this time, her posture had changed. Less confrontational, more humble. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice slightly shaky, "I owe you an apology." The Rock shook his head gently. And then, "No need to apologize," The Rock said, his voice steady yet understanding. "You were doing your job, asking tough questions, challenging assumptions. That's important work." But Sarah wasn't done. She shook her head, pressing forward. "No, I had it all wrong," she admitted. "I came here looking for a gotcha moment, a way to expose privilege. But instead—" She hesitated, taking a breath. "Instead, you helped us have a real conversation about what privilege actually means." The Rock nodded, finishing the thought for her. "About the responsibility that comes with any advantage we might have, whether it's family connections, natural talent, or just having someone who believes in us." He gestured for Sarah to join him and Marcus at the front. A brief hesitation, then she stepped forward. "You know what the real story is here?" The Rock asked, addressing Sarah and the entire room. "It's not about me. It's not about privilege, or success, or social media. It's about how we use whatever platform we have to lift others up." He turned to Marcus. "Whether that platform is a college newspaper," then to Sarah, "or a major digital publication." Finally, he looked to the room at large. "Or a foundation that can build facilities across the country. The question isn't how you got your platform." He let the words hang in the air for a moment. "It's what you do with it." Marcus nodded, his energy infectious. "That's exactly what I want to write about in my article. Not just the new facilities, but the fact that success. It's not about where you start. It's about how hard you're willing to work, how many times you're willing to get back up, and how many people you're willing to help up along the way." The Rock's grin widened. Now that's a story worth telling. The entire energy of the room had shifted. Gone was the earlier tension, the sharp edge of confrontation. Reporters who had expected a standard celebrity charity announcement now found themselves part of something much deeper. As the press conference drew to a close, people started gathering their things. But no one seemed in a hurry to leave. Small groups formed, hushed conversations unfolding as journalists mentally rewrote their articles. Near the front, Marcus turned to Sarah Chan. "Ms. Chan," he said, extending a hand, "would you maybe be interested in co-writing a piece? Your platform, my perspective, about what real opportunity looks like." Sarah blinked, surprised. Then she smiled. "I think that's exactly the kind of story I should be telling." The Rock, watching the exchange, nodded in quiet satisfaction. Then, turning to Marcus Rodriguez, who had also joined him on stage, he chuckled. "Well, brother, this didn't exactly go as planned." Marcus laughed. "No, it went better. Way better." As the last attendees made their way toward the exits, The Rock stepped back up to the podium one final time. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "success isn't just about where you start. It's about how hard you're willing to work, how many times you're willing to get back up, and, most importantly, how many people you're willing to help up along the way." A few reporters, packing up their gear, discreetly wiped their eyes. Sarah Chen approached The Rock one last time, extending her hand. "Thank you," she said, simply, sincerely. He shook her hand warmly. "Let's use our platforms to lift people up, instead of tearing them down." The convention center finally emptied, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The Dreams to Reality Youth Foundation had set out to announce new buildings. But instead, they had built something far greater. Bridges of understanding, platforms for authentic conversation, and, most importantly, renewed hope for those who need it most. At the very back of the room, Marcus Thompson, the young college journalist, stood by the exit, taking one last look at the space where his life had come full circle. The Rock's words echoed in his mind, and he knew. His next article wouldn't just be about a press conference. It would be about second chances, about the power of authentic leadership, and about the true meaning of using your platform for good.